You might have heard the phrase, there is no canon in 40k, or everything is canon in 40k, or everything is canon in 40k, but not everything is true. And it's a bit of a throwaway joke, like there are no wolves on Fenris. But this relationship Games Workshop have with canon is a really important thing to bear in mind when you're looking at 40k background, particularly old background. Obviously, there is a body of work that comprises 40k, and we're all able to have these conversations about it because we all understand what that is. But Warhammer doesn't usually fit in with the way the terms canon and retcon are used in other media. So first off, what do the terms mean? Canon is the first thing to deal with. The word has a couple of definitions, but the one we're interested in is this one, a collection or list of sacred books accepted as genuine. A term that was originally used in Christian religious debate and is related to the legal concept of canon law. In Christianity, canons were originally laws agreed by a church council or handed down by apostles. Anyway, it's from this definition that we get the use of the term in fictional worlds. In fiction, canon is the material accepted as officially part of the story in an individual universe of that story. It is often contrasted with or used as the basis for works of fan fiction. That should be easy enough, but in some franchises there are more steps than that. Hierarchies of how much something should be considered canon based on who published it. Thankfully, Games Workshop don't do that. If it's published by Games Workshop, or a subsidiary of Games Workshop, or a company licensed by Games Workshop to produce materials set in their world, it's in the canon. 40k Codex? Canon. Forge World Supplement? Canon. Black Library Novel? Canon. Fantasy Flight Games RPG Sourcebook? Just as canon as everything else. So, what happens when the people who write the canon want to change something? A retcon is defined as a piece of new information that imposes a different interpretation on previously described events, typically used to facilitate a dramatic plot shift or account for an inconsistency. The idea is that in other areas of popular culture which have been around for a long time, multiple different writers have done things that may result in contradictions in the continuity of the setting. Either deliberately, the company wanted to change something, or accidentally. That new retroactive continuity, the retcon, becomes the canon, the official thing that happened, and the old continuity is discarded. Warhammer 40k has been around for decades and it's been written by lots of different writers, so you'd think this would be a big issue. And yeah, sometimes it is. Games Workshop have occasionally explicitly retconned things in the world, and there are even a couple of Black Library books that were declared hereticus, and a few modern ones that have been subtly changed to fit in with the timeline. But it's not a very common thing, and Games Workshop have a few strategies they use to avoid retcons. First, the settings for Warhammer games are so big, particularly in the case of Warhammer 40k, that they're impossible to exhaustively map. So when they want to add something, they mostly just stick it in and then say it was there all along, they just haven't got round to talking about it yet. At the time of writing, Paragon warsuits were just added to the Sisters army, but according to their fluff, they've just always had them. No one's going to go back and change the old Sisters novels to include them. We just assume that the people in those novels, for whatever reason, didn't have access to them. The universe is a big place. Resources can be scarce. Who knows? Occasionally, Games Workshop will actually add something to the timeline, but even then, it doesn't remove the thing that existed before. This is just another option, another thing in the universe, another planet, another suit of armor. And when they do want to remove something, they tend to just let it fade into the background. And that works because 40k also has a really broad timeline. As well as being a geographically huge world with plenty of room for variation across it, it's also a game that takes place over thousands of years. The 40k world now has a current timeline and plot that advances, but Black Library publish current novel series that are set hundreds of years before that timeline, and they're still considered modern 40k. These two characters both have ongoing plot lines in the 40k setting, though in the timeline they existed hundreds of years apart from each other. If Guilliman returns next Wednesday, Gaunt existed at the time of the Crusades. And your game could be taking place at any point in those thousands of years. 40k has been designed with loads of gaps, and most editions are just filling a few more of them. Not everything is the same across the whole universe, and not everything was the same at every moment in the setting. So the squat homeworlds exist, and they have their armies of bikers and Brotherhood troops, and they get eaten by Tyranids, but there are still squats out there. All of those pieces of information were introduced by different authors at different times, but they're also all true in the 40k setting, depending on where or when you're playing. None of this is a retcon. Games Workshop didn't retract some previous fluff. It's all either plot advancement or additions to fill the gaps. Similarly, in all the original stories about the Great Crusade, it stated that the Chaos Powers stole the infant Primarchs from the Emperor's laboratory on Terra and scattered them to the stars. But, and spoilers for the Siege of Terra series here, in Saturnine, Erda, a contemporary of the Emperor, tells John Grammaticus that she was the one who caused the warp vortex that scattered the Primarchs. So is that a retcon? Well, some people in the comments on my other videos think so, but 40k is rarely as simple as that. We knew the Primarchs were scattered into the warp. We never knew how. Like many things in 40k, it's deliberately vague, and so's Erda's explanation. So is this 100% Erda's work and Chaos had nothing to do with it anymore? Or did Erda merely allow the forces of the warp, or chaos, in? Is this really a retcon or a Games Workshop just adding more detail? And if this ever causes any actual contradictions, well, then they can fall back on unreliable narrator. Every story in the background is told from the point of view of someone, maybe there are differing accounts. There's a load of these simple things, like the unreliable colour of Tau blood or the height of Space Marines. The explanation is, well, maybe whoever's writing this in world is just wrong or working from out-of-date information. In the original Horus Heresy story, they referred to chapters of Space Marines rather than legions of Space Marines because they hadn't written that bit yet. When you read that now, you just sort of assume the scribe who wrote it was missing some information. And look, having stuff written in world can cause problems too. If your setting includes an evil fascist faction, but almost all the text about their actions is written from their point of view, then maybe some people will find it difficult to separate the setting and the faction. But this way of working allows loads more flexibility in a game that isn't really intended to have a linear timeline. It's designed to be flexible. And generally, old fluff is always kept around in some form. If you like something about the setting and Games Workshop do something new with it, then the likelihood is the version you like still exists somewhere. No one's forcing you to take the Paragon Warsuits. Old models are still fine to use. So there's a few ways Games Workshop's construction of the setting avoids the need for overt retcons or discussions of what is and isn't canon. But why? Why go down the route of constant additions, conflicting stories, and unreliable narrators? Well, Warhammer isn't a linear story like a comic book or a video game or film series designed to be followed from start to end. It's a setting that's deliberately designed to give people as much latitude as possible when they pick out the toys they want to model and paint. And when you listen to how the game designers view it, this becomes really clear. With Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000, the notion of canon is a fallacy. Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 exist as tens of thousands of overlapping realities in the imaginations of games developers, writers, readers, and gamers. None of those interpretations is wrong. That's from Gav Thorpe. It all stems from the assumption there's a binding contract between author and reader to adhere to some non-existent subjective construct or true representation of the setting. There is no such contract and no such objective truth. That's Andy Hoare, who's written a lot of 40k, or this from Mark Gascoigne back when he used to head up Black Library. Here's our standard line. Yeah, it's all official, but remember that we're reporting back from a time when stories aren't always true, or at least 100% accurate. If it has the 40k logo on it, it exists in the 40k universe, or it was a legend that may well have happened, or a rumor that may or may not have any truth behind it. The full quote I found on Aaron Dembski-Bowden's blog, which is well worth a read. I'll link to it below. So the traditional concept of canon doesn't really work with 40k, and how much of 40k's changes are retcons is open to discussion. Arguably, you only really need the term canon if you have multiple different continuities and you have to define which one's the real one. Since 40k doesn't do that, you could say there is no canon in 40k, or you could say that everything's canon in 40k. Your choice. Thanks for watching.